Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, an unrehearsed panel discussion of the U.S. government's wars and the racism they inspire. Our program is presented by members and friends of AWARE, a local peace group. AWARE is an acronym for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. President Obama said 2 months ago the Democrats in office have ended 2 wars. He meant Iraq and Afghanistan. But in fact, he was lying, just as he lied to get elected in 2008 and 2012 when he said that he was opposed to U.S. war-making. In Iraq and Syria, the Islamic State, a direct result of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, continues to kill people, and in Afghanistan, the U.S. Air Force attacked a hospital run by Doctors Without Borders. The war on Afghanistan enters year 15 this week. Almost 6 years after President Obama's 2009 surge, he sent tens of thousands more U.S. troops to Afghanistan as soon as he was in office. There remain today close to 10,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan, with the Pentagon talking up the need to keep those troops there and add more. And Obama says quietly this week that indeed most of them will be there after he leaves office. Our friends at Voices for Creative Nonviolence in Chicago are mobilizing activists to gather in front of hospitals around the U.S. and elsewhere in the world under the message, dropping bombs here would be a war crime. That is, in front of American hospitals. And under that, the same is true in Afghanistan. There was a protest this afternoon in Chicago in front of Stroger Hospital in downtown Chicago. Meanwhile, in Washington, the group Code Pink protested at the Senate Armed Services Committee hearing today. But you probably haven't heard of these protests because the cooperative media doesn't report objections to Obama's war policy, except for those calling for more killing, not less, as we do. Our group, AWARE, was established 14 years ago after the attacks of 9/11-2001 by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government would use those crimes to justify its already long-standing attempts to exercise military control over the Middle East. Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia, and control of them gives the U.S. an advantage over China, Germany, and other countries. Today, President Obama's administration is making war in 8 countries, 2 more than George Bush: Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, and the Philippines, in violation of international law, which forbids the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state without the authorization of the UN Security Council. President Obama is also sending American death squads, we call them Special Operations Forces, into 135 countries by the admission of the Special Operation Force around the world, where their operations include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. And he's conducting a secret series of murders by drones that's already killed more than 6,000 people, including U.S. citizens and hundreds of children. His drone attacks have been called the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times. It targets people suspected of perhaps intending to harm us someday, and any unfortunates who happen to be nearby. President Obama is killing people around the world in wars that are not in the interest of the vast majority of Americans, who are taxed to pay for them and forced to forego government services, to the point that the U.S. is now the most unequal developed country and is becoming more so at an increasing rate. Our government remains what the Reverend Martin Luther King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. The Obama administration is even willing to risk nuclear war with Russia in order for the U.S. to control the Eurasian economy. Because war is good for business, for some. We Americans should be concerned with how the government, which supposedly represents us, uses terrorism as an excuse to enhance the profits of the very rich, the 1%. And it's working. 95% of income gains during the Obama administration have gone to the 1%, while wages have continued to be flat or declining for most Americans. Median family income has continued to decline in the Obama years. Only a few American politicians on the right and left fringes of the Republican and Democratic parties are actually opposed to the Obama administration's killing of people abroad, or even at home, through our militarized police forces, who kill far more people than in other developed countries. President Obama's so-called nuclear deal with Iran, which should be supported since the alternative is even more U.S. killing in the Mideast, is not really about nuclear weapons. Iran doesn't have one, while Israel has hundreds and the U.S. has thousands, but rather about reincorporating Iran into the U.S. system of control of energy resources, along with other U.S. clients, notably Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, Turkey, and the GCC. The leaders of the U.S. government have killed, wounded, and made homeless well over 20 million human beings in the last 50 years, mostly civilians. Today we see the results of the war policy of U.S. administrations, Republican and Democrat alike, in the vast refugee crisis overwhelming Europe. We need to press the government for whom we're responsible to solve it, since our government's policies have caused it. In their book on the last presidential election campaign, Mark Halperin and John Heilemann quote President Obama as follows: "Turns out I'm really good at killing people. Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine." Close quote. The remark hasn't been denied by the White House, and however ironically he said it, it turns out to be true. The noted reporter Seymour Hersh exposed Obama's lies about the death of Osama bin Laden. Hersh wrote, quote, "High-level lying remains the modus operandi of U.S. foreign policy in the Obama administration, along with secret prisons, drone attacks, special forces night raids, bypassing the chain of command, and cutting out those who might say no." Close quote. Our job tonight is to give a more honest account of the Obama administration's criminal war policy and how it relates to the so-called Iran nuclear deal, the U.S. media demonization of Russia, and Israel's desperate interference in local U.S. politics, and the supine collapse of local liberals in the Illinois legislature and the local university. So we'll hear from Ron Zoke on the Old Black Magic, Karen Aram on Russia's intervention in Syria, and David Green on libertarians and the anti-war movement. And we'll begin with Ron Zoke, that Old Black Magic. I assume that has something to do with the statue, Ron.
Oh, yes, yeah. Right. Well, this is my fetish of the day. What I'm alluding to is the kind of wishful and some say magical thinking that goes on among our foreign policy and military elite in the view of some people. So I went back to some of the classical works on magic, primitive magic as it's called, although we're not allowed to say primitive anymore. That's
That's old-fashioned, right?
Yeah, well, it's not politically correct. No. We have to say pre-literate or something. By the accounts by James Fraser in The Magic Bow and the Polish-British cultural anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski, Magic, Science, and Religion, and so on. But it's a little hard to disentangle this because magic meant a very different thing in the ancient world than it means today. Today it's viewed as a kind of entertainment in nightclubs and so on, but it was taken very seriously in the ancient world. When we talk about the Magi, for example, in the Bible, they were considered magicians, astrologers, sorcerers, those who could describe the future and so on, and it was a very different matter. Anyway, there's an interesting writer on American foreign policy, Derek Liebert, who has written a 2010 book, Magic and Mayhem, about the delusions of American foreign policy. Here's one little paragraph from the jacket flap copy. Afghanistan and Iraq are the latest in a string of blunders that includes Vietnam and an unintended war with China from 1950 to 53. I think he means Korea. Those four fiascos being just the worst moments in nearly a lifetime of false urgencies, intelligence failures, grandiose designs, and stereotyping of enemies and allies alike. America brought down the Soviet Empire at the Cold War's most dangerous juncture, but even that victory was surrounded by myths such as the conviction that we can easily shape the destinies of other people. And he goes on to have chapters about the emergency men, for example, the sources of magic, the mystique of American management. We can rebuild societies, reorient them and so on. A world to be labeled, not understood. Myths of history, we'll show them the light. And conclusion, finding our better angels. He apparently teaches foreign policy at Georgetown. You went to Georgetown, didn't you?
No, I went to George Washington.
George Washington, okay,
Yes.
sorry.
Georgetown is much preppier.
Yeah, okay.
Georgetown is a wholly owned subsidiary of the State Department.
Yeah, actually it is. I
Yeah.
live down the street from Georgetown, but I didn't
Ah.
attend that
Yeah, I
university.
wonder how this guy's surviving there.
Because that's that's an acceptable official line.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We can safely conclude that the American foreign policy establishment is not up to the task of world leadership as posed by the country's far-flung political and military involvements, which it has done much to create. In particular, what's not up to the task is the national security establishment, quote unquote, meaning the think tankers, the professors, the appointees, and former officials, lawyers, lobbyists, and business people who concern themselves with the nation's securities. In fact, most of those authorities at the Council on Foreign Relations, at the Aspen or the American Enterprise Institutes, or the Kennedy or Wilson schools, so on. He goes on to say his second conclusion derives from the first one that I just mentioned. America will benefit from reducing its well-meant but readily militarized and poorly conducted ground commitments around the world. Time and again, American energy propelled by the valor of ignorance plays into the hands of our opponents, whether marching to China's border on the Yalu, throwing 500,000 men into Vietnam, or today playing all too dynamically into al-Qaeda's hands by setting out to remake Iraq, Afghanistan, the Middle East, while appearing to equate every Muslim resistance or independence movement with terrorism. So already a sober half of all Americans conclude that the United States should mind its own business. It's silly to regard this as some outburst of isolationist sentiment rather than a level-headed response to a lifetime of emergencies and to realizing that those responsible, no matter how exalted, are mostly winging it. So I think there's a lot of truth in that, although I'm not certain what he means in particular by some of that. So what is magic? The online dictionary defines it as the art or practice of using charms, spells, and rituals to attempt to produce supernatural effects or control events in nature, or the charms, spells, and rituals so used. And the second possible meaning is the exercise of sleight of hand or conjuring, again making something seem to disappear for entertainment. And third, a mysterious quality of enchantment. Quote, "For me, the names of those men breathed the magic of the past," from Max Beerbohm. So yeah, it has a range of meanings. And the practitioners of magic, magicians, witches, sorcerers, wise men, magi, and so on. Actually, little is heard about the consultation with astrologers by Nancy Reagan when she was in the White House, although it happened. So how do we rid ourselves of wishful and magical thinking? Well, an attempt to be self-critical, to recognize the limits of American power, and question skeptically those people who think that because we have so much money and so much firepower that the rest of the world will yield to us sooner or later, and the USA will rule the world. So the notion of magic is a colligation of many kinds of behavior, as black magic, which is devoted to harming others, apparently, as in voodoo and witchcraft. White magic, benefiting each other. The principal place you'll find talk about magic these days is in the bridal magazines, where they are trying to sell magic and enchantment. And it's amazing that in a supposedly scientifically minded, enlightened age, that there would be so many appeals, whether explicitly or implicitly, to magic and the effects of carrying out certain behavioral or verbal rituals, and so on. So the root of magical and wishful thinking is the idea that wouldn't it be nice if P, therefore P, and there's a rather effective attack on it, at least in foreign and military policy, in Liebert's book. So I'll stop there for now and
Thank you,
return
Ron.
to that if necessary.
I think. I want to get medieval on your assumptions at some point before the hour is out, but I think we'll let our colleagues talk about these
Yeah,
their issues first. We'll go to Karen
Yeah,
Aram and talk about the Russian
Well,
intervention
before I
in
get to
Syria.
that, I have to say, I'm sitting here laughing, imagining Ron reading a bridal magazine, but I guess that's not what you're referring to. And I too have problems with the premise of which this book is based on, the premise being that, here again, it's like, oh, well, we have to stop wearing rose-colored glasses and because look how we blundered. And I'm saying that, no, we have succeeded, given that our goal is to create chaos and destruction and just take over the world as we have, and weaken other nations as much as we have. So I guess it's a different perspective. But anyway, yeah, Russian intervention. We're hearing a lot right now about Russian intervention into Syria. And of course, the U.S. Government, Obama, and the corporate-owned media are all using this as an opportunity to vilify Putin. And he may have placed himself in a rather, let's say, difficult position for this, but I think he's so used to being vilified that it doesn't matter. Now, I recognize that he has interest, certainly, in supporting his ally, Syria, Assad, and I gather he was invited by the al-Assad government to intervene on their behalf. And I guess he's actually been quite successful when doing in 3 days what we've been trying to attempt supposedly for quite some time now. But I must say, when I see many on the left supporting his intervention, it gives me chills, because I cannot, if I cannot support intervention on behalf of my own nation, constantly intervening militarily, let me make it very clear, military intervention. I can only support humanitarian intervention, which is food, medical supplies, etc. So I'm not about, well, I'm not going to go out there and vilify Putin and Russia based upon the hypocrisy that we have been doing. If you take the supposed numbers of people killed by the Russian intervention, military intervention, something like 37 compared to how many have been killed based upon U.S. intervention, it would be highly hypocritical of me to do so. As an American, I'm responsible for what my nation does and the killings and destruction that my nation's responsible for. But I am a little chilled at the idea that the left seems to be so supportive of Russian military intervention on the basis that it may be pragmatic. I'm not so sure I agree. I think that the only solution to these problems and these issues is diplomatic. So I just wanted to make that point clear. I do have one other thing, Carl, if you don't mind, I think needs to be raised in respect to what you were talking about earlier, the bombing of the hospital, or as some are now saying, it was an airstrike, not a bombing. My attitude is that the results are the same. You know, the victims, I don't think, really are concerned with whether they were bombed or airstrike, because clearly they died horrible deaths, okay? And it's a terrible situation. But I do want to point out, as I did to someone today, earlier this morning, that if you look at the U.S. Defense Department Law Manual of Rules of Engagement, recently released this spring, the LMOR, it's pretty chilling that they have actually given credence to the fact that now we can pretty much do anything we want in battle and get away with it, and it will be justified. So we've gone completely against all international law, and this is so frightening, and I really fear that what we saw, maybe with this manual, maybe with this new Pentagon attitude, based upon the law now that we have created for ourselves, we've emboldened our military. And so they feel they can do whatever they want with impunity, as if they haven't been acting with impunity all along. So anyway, I just wanted to bring that up.
Thank you, Karen. We'll go to David Green and talk about libertarians in the anti-war movement. Do you have some particular in mind, David?
I did, actually. He's probably one of the most well-known, besides Ron Paul, libertarians identified with the anti-war movement, and it's the proprietor of the antiwar.com website. His name is Justin Raimondo, and he's been doing this for quite a long time. And his articles, which he publishes usually on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday of each week, are usually informative critiques of our various escapades in foreign policy. But something he wrote yesterday piqued my interest to want to come in here and at least read it and put it on the table. And it certainly relates to, I think, some of the problematic nature of what I consider to be the problematic nature of what Ron has been saying about what the motives of our foreign policy leaders are, and how we properly critique those, not just in terms of foreign policy, but in terms of from the libertarian perspective, this idea that America is indeed this exceptional country that has just somehow gone wrong, could have been unlike other empires, but for some reason or other is becoming like every other empire. So let me read you the couple of paragraphs from yesterday's article that provoked me to come in here to read this. Quote, "Baldly stated, the United States government is the greatest danger to peace and freedom the world has ever known. This is true precisely because it has held aloft the torch of liberty for so long, an example to the world of what a society based on individual freedom can achieve. That is the great paradox of American power. As we abandon our libertarian heritage, even as we retain the forms of a constitutional republic, we destroy what made our power possible. The process is reversible, according to Raimondo. We can restore our old republic, but only if we give up the mirage of empire. If we continue to pursue the fatal dream of a beneficent internationalism, America will lose itself, dissolve its unique character, and wreak destruction, not only on its own people, but on the peoples of the world. In switching roles with the Soviets, we prefigure their fate." He had previously in this article described the fall of the Soviet Empire and correctly didn't necessarily attribute it to American pressure, but to its own internal weakness. And the resulting implosion, that is of our own society, is going to shake the world to its foundations in a way that the fall of the Kremlin never did. In programming our own self-destruction, we will likely drag much of the world with us. End quote. So therefore, we have a libertarian perspective which of critique of foreign policy, a perfectly proper critique of the destructive nature of our foreign policy, but I would suggest not an accurate critique of what the motives of our foreign policy really are, of what not an accurate critique of what the allegedly idealistic motives of our foreign policy really are, because from the libertarian perspective, and again, libertarianism, American libertarianism is unique unto itself in its advocacy for its identification with free markets and many aspects of the neoliberal program, which are indeed also the source of our foreign policy. So this analysis of the essential republican virtue of our country gone wrong as we expand our capital, our idealism around the world, to me explains why it's so difficult partly perhaps why it's so difficult for libertarians to join with the anti-war left, not only at the level of what our economic programs are, but to a certain extent, the nature of what our anti-war analysis and solution to that problem might be. If you're going to begin with the assumption that America is idealistic, or as Ron referred to in what he read, sort of makes blundering efforts to do good, it seems to me that you're not going to understand what the motives, what the more obvious and I think less hidden motives of our foreign policy elites are. And I think we can see those very clearly. This morning, Paul Street on the Counterpunch website has what is basically a review, partly at least, a review of the recent book by Lawrence Shoup about the Council on Foreign Relations, describing this group of individuals that has guided U.S. foreign policy since the 1930s. And the Shoup's previous book covered from the 30s to the 70s, published in the 70s. And the most recent book brings us up to date over the past four decades. And Paul Street rightfully describes it and supports this view in terms of the overt power of the Council on Foreign Relations to guide U.S. foreign policy in the very ways in which are manifest. So that's, I think, a better way to begin to talk about foreign policy as American capitalism spread around the world for very material reasons, whatever the idealistic tone that the neocons or Henry Kissinger or anyone else might ascribe to it. And that's all. I'll end my comments there.
Thank you, David. You're watching Aware on the Air. We are talking about the sources of American foreign policy and the horrors like the attack on the hospital in Afghanistan that occurred this week in the beginning of the 15th year of the U.S. assault on Afghanistan. The attack on the hospital was lied about immediately by the American government, but those lies have broken down, and it's pretty clear now that the U.S. military attacked a hospital run by Doctors Without Borders and killed 24 people in the midst of the ongoing war in Afghanistan, which President Obama declared that he had ended a week or two ago. I'd like to say a word about these interesting accounts of American foreign policy that we've heard this evening. Two accounts, I think, are both quite wrong. The liberal account that Ron was quoting at the beginning and the libertarian account that David was quoting right now. The first depends upon the notion that American policy is full of blunders, mistakes, stupidities, that American policymakers are just dumb and do stupid things, and that the horrors that we perceive around the world are a result of this American stupidity, which if the policymakers only listened to intelligent academics, like the author of the book that Ron quoted, they wouldn't be able to make these dumb mistakes. I think this is a dangerous way of looking at it. The people who run American foreign policy are not stupid. We went to school with them. We know who they are. I mean, these are not dumb people. The crimes committed by American foreign policy are not blunders, they're crimes. They're done consciously and purposely, and they intended to, the authors of these crimes intended to do them. For example, the great crimes of the post-war period, the American assault on Southeast Asia that killed perhaps 4 million people, and the American assault on Southwest Asia in the last 15 years that has killed well over 1 million. These are not mistakes. This is American policy, and the libertarians are closer to the matter when they try to understand why this policy is being followed. I think the libertarians are blinkered too when they notice there was some point at which the old republic behaved virtuously and now it isn't, and therefore the account has to be understood in terms of the departure from virtue. As David, I think, suggested, it's not clear that virtue was ever there. When George Washington refers to the country that he becomes president of as an infant empire, and when recent historical studies talk about the extent to which the American Revolution was a protection of slavery, fundamentally, that the revolution broke out not for liberty and justice for all, but because the American elites of the late 18th century were afraid that the British government was moving towards the abolition of the slave trade, which they were, and that had to be defended in America. We have a better picture, I think, of what the United States is and has been all along. American foreign policy serves the interest of the American ascendancy, the 1%, the American elite, and it can be understood as rational in Weber's sense of setting means to ends. Once we understand what the ends of American foreign policy are, and that means the ends, the purposes of the American elite, it's very easy to see how the policies are set to achieve those ends. They don't always work. There are others in the world who contest the attempt of the American 1% to run the world economy for their purposes, and sometimes the costs to the American ascendancy gets too high, and the American ascendancy changes its policies. That certainly is the account of Vietnam. The resistance in Vietnam simply became too expensive, particularly once the American army in Vietnam revolted. But the liberal interpretation of this is what seems to me to be so wrong. David quoted the famous response of the New York Times about the Vietnam War near its conclusion. They pointed out that, of course, it began as a blundering attempt to do good. So not even began, it was always a blundering attempt to do good. Now, the fact that the leading liberal columnists in the country could write this in the 1970s is really quite amazing. But it certainly shows up the extent to which our account of what has happened in American foreign policy is conditioned liberally by liberals, by libertarians and others in favor of the projects and purposes of the American 1%. You can't escape by saying they made mistakes. What you have to do is understand what they were trying to do and how criminal those attempts were. Comments? Ron, I guess it's your turn.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, well, I don't agree that there was any implication of stupidity here. These people who engage in wishful and magical thinking are quite bright, sometimes by their own account, sometimes by that of others. And they consider themselves the very best and the brightest and are generally accounted. So the point is that the smarter you are, in many cases, the more vulnerable you are to wishful and magical thinking, because you're trying to put things together in ways that are not borne out by the facts and the causal influences that are actually going on in society. So that's the classic mistake of people who well, come up with superstitions, for example. They're generally the brightest people around, and they're seeing causal influences and connections where none really exist, and they're unable to think critically about is this really the case, and does the evidence bear it out? So I don't agree that there's any implication of stupidity here. In fact, it's quite the opposite. although it turns out to be in the longer run a blunder, but that's not really part of the indictment. To David, I would ask, is there a kind of collective collective motive behind things? Classic problem in dealing with any groups of people is their implicit and sometimes unconscious agendas about what they're trying to do or bring about and so on. And there are endless problems, conceptual and otherwise, about attributing motives and intentions to whole groups of people. The libertarians seem to be devoted to something like individualism in this respect, and they would say it's a conceptual mistake to think that collectives such as whole nations or political parties or government agencies can have agendas of their own. So at some level, there seems to be something to that, but I think it's extremely dangerous because it will put you in the business then of condemning them because of their imputed motives, and it will not be shared by a whole lot of people. A really seems to be pathological example of trying to indict people on the basis of their supposed motives are in a piece by Stephen Lee Myers, New York Times, October 4th, in Putin's Syria intervention, fear of a weak government hand. And it goes on to recount the experiences that supposedly created Putin's outlook and opinion. The specter of mass protest or mob rule is one that has haunted Mr. Putin throughout his political life, and that fear lies at the heart of his belief in the primacy of state authority above all else, both at home and abroad. That's just incredible.
Yeah.
That's
Nonsense.
yeah.
Nonsense, yeah.
Well, let me respond to the part about what,
Sure.
who, the old question, who rules, who governs.
Yeah.
And again, I have to refer back to Shoup's work. The original work from 1975 or so was called Imperial Brain Trust, written with a man named Minter, describing the Council on Foreign Relations, detailing its members, detailing their elite status, the sectors which they come from, corporate, banking, legal, journalism, media, and so forth. The current book, which I have not read yet, and Carl, perhaps you can remind me of the title of it if you can look it up there.
Well, I'm reading it now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's it called?
The Wall
Street's
Street's think tank, yes.
Wall Street?
Yes.
Wall
Wall
Street
Street's think tank.
Wall Street's think
Yes,
tank.
yes.
Yeah, and so what they're describing, what Shoup now, I assume Minter has passed, but what Shoup is describing again is these interlocking, this kind of, I was thinking of it on the way in terms of the phrase the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. Now that's a phrase that I think Lenin used to describe our government itself, but this is really the brain trust of our government. These are the people that hold together the general elite interests as they're acted out around the world, that mediate between the different corporate interests, the different profit motives, to always keeping in mind the general matter of controlling the empire, which is about the use of force, which is about money and banking, which is about currency, and which is about cultivating elites in other countries that work with elite interests in our own countries. This has been going on for a really long time at both a rational and obviously very destructive level. But again, it's been going on according to plan, okay? Not that the plans aren't always changing, not that the plans always work, not that they can always get what they want, but the argument is that they've done a pretty good job, in a sense, of making the United States the most powerful empire that the world has ever known. And the cracks that we see have been seen before. They have always been responded to. They've been responded to in the manner after the Vietnam. Well, there were cracks after World War II, and then after the Vietnam War, they were responded to in such a way that we're familiar with. The trilateral commission, which we often refer to, was basically an adjunct of the Council on Foreign Relations. It developed the plan going forward. The Powell memo basically reflected those same concerns, and so America got back in the saddle, so to speak, after the Vietnam War, and has been riding along ever since.
Thank you, David. You're watching News from Neptune. It's
No.
Karen Aram's turn.
Aware on the air, Carl.
I'm sorry, did I just say it?
Yes, News from
We
Neptune.
do another
yes.
program here.
Yes,
Several
yes,
of us
yes.
are on the other program,
Right.
and I'm obviously slipped out of.
Yeah, but people can watch that on Fridays at
Yeah.
7 in the evening or Saturdays at 2. It's also very good with the same people.
Half the time on that program, I called it Aware on the Air. So
Yeah,
the reason-
exactly. I watch it, so I know. Yeah, I do have a couple things I wanted to comment on in respect first to the Council on Foreign Relations. Yes, and this is just a trivial thing, but Stephen Cohen was interviewed by a German journalist in a German newspaper. It was posted on Russia Insider. I posted it on Facebook. And Stephen Cohen is the foremost, I would say, American authority on Russia, Russian studies. He's affiliated with several universities, and he was on the air several times. He was interviewed by various different people throughout the corporate media. But finally, he was completely wiped out of all of that. And you could see him sometimes on Democracy Now! But you get nothing from him now, absolutely nothing. And in the interview, he was asked by the interviewer something to the effect that he's a member of the CFR. And he was really careful to say, well, I'm a member. Many, many, many people and organizations are. But he pointed out that he's not a member or in touch with or in communication with the elite members of the CFR, which is a very small group that set policy. And I want to point out that we know Zbigniew Brezhnev, who is a member of the CFR.
Brzezinski.
What did I say? Brezhnev. Sorry about that. My
You're
head's
just
in
trying to
Russia.
make me feel better about those slips, Karen. Thank you.
My head's in Russia today. But Brzezinski, who is a very strong influence on the Obama administration in regards to NATO on the border of the Ukraine, or I should say right there on the Ukraine border, which is the border of Russia, as well as Kissinger, Henry Kissinger, who has over the years been a strong influence of our foreign policy. He's a member of the CFR, but he doesn't agree with Brzezinski as to what we're doing on the border of Russia. But either way, those are the people that government and policymakers listen to. And I think I even mentioned that in the book, The Wall Street Think Tank by Lawrence Shoup. He mentions in a paragraph where Timothy Geithner, most of the phone calls he made as the Treasury Secretary were to members of the CFR. They would have been the elitist group. So that organization is probably the greatest influence on our foreign policy. I also agree with everything that Carl said, and also with David, that only after really getting in and reading and studying so much of what's been happening, I now have come to the conclusion also that we were never trying to help anyone. Our interventions have always been pure greed, and we have achieved much of what we wanted, and that is destruction and chaos. Now, the final results will be, I think, a disaster for us. I really do, because we have so weakened our own nation that we are going to suffer the consequences. But I think we've been blinded, and I think we have been blinded to that, or not blinded. That's actually wrong. I don't think we've been blinded to that. I think the majority of people are blinded to it, although I think we're seeing it now. But I think that the government leaders and the people that they represent simply don't care, because as long as we're supporting that upper echelon of the elite, that they will continue this policy. what we're doing in Syria is a continuation of what we did in Libya, a continuation of what we did in Iraq and everywhere else in the world. And Ron, something you said when you mentioned about something to do with the, in the book here on the leaflet when you were reading it, that it must be an error when he refers to our war in Korea, that it was with, that he says China, our war with China when we were in Korea. Well, actually, that was about China.
No, I didn't say it was an error. I think that was my way of glossing what he says about we were implicitly at war with China. And I said I think what he meant was the Korean War.
He probably did mean the Korean War, yeah, because that, here again, how many people realize that that was really about China? I don't know. I'll rest.
Ron likes to quote Hegel's remark that the owl of Minerva flies only at twilight, and Hegel in his Germanic and Baroque fashion was referring to the fact that we understand history, we understand the philosophy of history, we understand what's going on, as it were, only as it's ending, only after it's over. And that's true, it seems to me, in an important way when we come to talk about American foreign policy and what the government we're responsible to is doing, we're responsible for is doing. If we look, for example, at the Vietnam War, which continues to have a paradigmatic function in American political thinking, we find that Hegel was, at least in this area, correct. Lawrence Shoup's book, the first one that we've been referring to, in fact was the source of the understanding of a lot of people that the U.S. planned the outcome of the Second World War. The U.S. government policymakers planned for the way in which the U.S. would profit from the Second World War before the U.S. even entered the war. The Second World War is said to begin in September of '39 when Germany invaded Poland, and that's as convenient a date as any. But what Shoup pointed out in his first book was that already by then the U.S. was planning for, U.S. planners were thinking about what should eventuate from a European war. They called it grand area planning. The grand area being roughly the developed world and Eurasia, what the traditional American policymakers had referred to as the world island. How is the world island going to be arranged after the end of this coming war? American planners were saying even before the war began. And their notion was that whatever happens, the U.S. would emerge as a dominant player in world politics at the end of that war, perhaps because Germany, whether Germany won or lost, the notion would be the U.S. would be the only real counter to Germany after the end of the war. Many people saw that. If you read Winston Churchill's own self-serving account of the Second World War, it's clear from the beginning that he feels he has a choice between a German-led Europe and an American-led Europe, that the British-led Europe of his youth was irretrievably lost, and that the question was to find some new way in which Britain could profit best from, and by Britain, of course, he meant the British 1%, could profit best from the coming war. Now, this sort of grand area planning goes on all along. I mean, as I say, the notion, this picture we have, which for propaganda purposes, of American presidents blundering from one thing to another, running into one problem and another, presented by usually evil forces abroad, is self-serving by American policymakers, and it's nonsense. Take, for example, the Vietnam War, which, as I say, the liberal interpretation has always been it began as a blundering it was a blundering attempt to do good. The Vietnam War was sold to the American people as stopping the international march of communism. In fact, there was no international march of communism that needed to be stopped by the American ascendancy. The communists were not about to take Connecticut, and the possibilities were fairly clear. What was at stake was a demonstration to the rest of the world, on the part of the United States, that as the dominant state in the world after the Second World War, no country in the world could remove its economy from coordination with the worldwide economy run by the United States. And the problem was that these primitive people, Ron was talking about, in Southeast Asia seemed to have the idea that they could organize their own economy as not part of that American worldwide economy, and that they could organize it for their purposes rather than for the purposes of the American 1%. That couldn't be allowed. And the U.S. took up the attempt to reestablish France's colonial occupation of Southeast Asia in order to prevent the threat of a good example, as the head of Amnesty International called it. That is, the threat of a country which ran its economy for the purposes of its own people rather than part of an American economic colonial empire. If we understand that, if we understand what the U.S. was doing against the propaganda, which, remember, the U.S. was directing primarily to Americans, the only force that the U.S. government fears is the American public, therefore they're the ones who have to be kept right on this. If we understand what the U.S. was doing in Southeast Asia, as opposed to what they were saying, we understand that the U.S. won the Vietnam War. The U.S. didn't achieve its maximum war aims. Its maximum war aims would be to incorporate Southeast Asia back into that economic hegemony that the U.S. Had at the end of the Second World War, and prevent the removal of American troops from the region. The first part of that was achieved. Vietnam was begging for factories to make Nike sneakers and things like that after the end of the war. We destroyed that country, killed 4 million people, and destroyed the economy, and destroyed the possibility of the threat of a good example. Destroyed the possibility of a country that ran its economy for the benefit of its citizens rather than for the American worldwide.
And now they're a party to the Trans-Pacific Partnership that we read about this
There
Right.
we are.
Right.
That's right. The notion that the U.S. lost the war in Vietnam is just false. And to understand the war in Vietnam as a unsuccessful, blundering attempt to do good, which is the liberal position, misrepresents the history. The Owl of Minerva flies at twilight, and it's pretty clear what she has on her mind when it comes to Vietnam. You're watching, which is it again?
We're on the Air.
Thank you.
Well,
we
there's-
have time for concluding
Yeah,
comments.
well, there's this problem. Since 1945, we haven't had, it seems to me, clearly defined, realistic goals. How will we know when the war is over? And in World War II, it was going to be unconditional surrender of everyone that we were fighting, and that was more or less achieved. But since then, that's become a completely unrealistic kind of goal. And how can we tell when the war in Korea was over?
The war is over when the media stops talking about
Yeah,
it.
right.
We have
Yes.
wars now that are drone
There we go.
wars, that are stealth wars, that
Right.
are
Yeah.
special ops wars.
Right.
And therefore, we have people still there. We have troops and all kinds of personnel still there, which people don't really know about, that they don't read about in the papers
Right.
on any kind of regular basis. So that's modern warfare. That's how we deal with the problem of wars that go on and on and on. They're not classic land wars. They're
Right.
not. We simply bomb people, and whether by drones or otherwise, and we control them by means. We take a step forward with the idea that we didn't have to. We have an empire in which we haven't really colonized people. We've colonized elites of other countries. And then we
Exactly.
have an empire in which we control by force, but not by necessarily invading and occupying other countries, which we still do once in a while, but then we kind of get over that, we leave it, and we still control it by other violent means.
We send in McDonald's and Starbucks to occupy.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry.
Well, that's a-
No,
that's a
that's not a
different-
violent mean. No,
that's
a
different
we
story,
do
yeah.
a
It's-
lot behind the scenes.
Yeah.
This is what we do. So much of behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's now
exactly.
considered just too crude and obvious to put boots on the ground there, control them that way. Now
I mean, I
we
think-
control their them financially, culturally.
Right,
and so on.
right. Kiev, I think, is a perfect example of the kind of things that we do. I would like to touch on something here about leftists. David, you were referring, or rather, Mr. Raimondo was referring to the left as not being sort of on the same page as the libertarians he was referring to related to foreign policy. I just want to make it very clear to people, because this is really confusing to me. There are so many divisions within the left. It's really hard to categorize them, because the socialists, I believe, are all on the same page as us. And not all, though. There are socialist organizations that probably are
Right.
not. But
There are
it's so
57 varieties of socialism.
57 right. So okay. The point is that when it's easy to define the right, because generally speaking there aren't that many divisions within them. But within the so-called left, there are so many divisions, and you're right. There are liberals, and then you have the far left, and many of them are in concert with what Raimondo was referring to as libertarian foreign policy. So I just wanted to make that
Yeah,
point.
I mean, he didn't really mention the left, I don't think. I mean,
Yeah,
he,
you said
I don't know whether he
he did.
still believes that the left is kind of like communists, or kind of like, the Kremlin. But I think he must understand that there's a vibrant sort of what Chomsky would call socialist libertarian or anarchist
Right.
movements on the left that are anti-war. He doesn't do a lot himself to reach out to the left, although I have a feeling that there's probably more people or as many people on the left who read his website as people that he would call libertarian.
Right. Exactly. The
And
same
it's
as
a good
Ron Paul,
website
yeah.
it's a good website as a news source, as
Mm-hmm.
a daily news source of people who take the time to go through the wires from around the world and sort of piece together some of the things that are actually going on.
You've been watching Aware on the Air. Here's a summary of a nice discussion before the fact from David Swanson, who runs a worthwhile website under his own name and under the name of Let's Try Democracy, which also sounds like a good idea. Swanson writes, the United States military wants to dominate the earth to secure the economic hegemony of the 1%, has special forces active in 135 countries, and has troops stationed in some 180 countries. On a map of the world showing nations with no U.S. troops in them, Syria and Iran stand out like sore thumbs, as once upon a time did Iraq and Libya. Syria not only has no U.S. troops, it has Russian troops, and it's friendly towards Iran, which has no U.S. troops. Overthrowing the Syrian government, like Iraq's and Libya's and Iran's, has been on the Pentagon's bucket list for the 21st century. As early as 2006, the U.S. government had people on the ground in Syria working to overthrow that government. With the 2011 Arab Spring, the U.S. thought it saw an opportunity, and it helped turn the protests violent. That seems to me to be about right, and it seems to me that that's the discussion we should be having. What is the United States government actually doing, and what can be done to stop them? You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 41st week of 2015. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett, thanks to whom also this programs and others like it will be available on YouTube. Now, this is Carl Esterbrook for Ron Zook, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, Karen Aram, Michael Bay, David Johnson, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.